Welcome back to the Postpartum Plan podcast. This podcast is designed to support and empower you through postpartum. Whether you're expecting, in the early postpartum days, or beyond, this space is for you. I'm your host, Matteson, a dedicated postpartum doula and pediatric sleep consultant, striving to help parents feel confident and supported in their parenting journey. Each week, I'm sharing practical tips and expert advice to help you navigate all the postpartum things with confidence. Well, as much confidence as you can. Let's embark on this journey together, making your parenthood as serene and supportive as possible. Amber, they is a full spectrum doula and childbirth educator. She is passionate about working with the queer and fat plus-sized communities. Amber's work is strongly rooted in advocacy and education. Her goal is always to meet her clients where they are at and provide them with the experience and support. Thank you so much for joining me today, Amber. I'm excited to chat and to have you on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Of course. So before we kind of jump into all the things, do you want to tell everybody a little bit about yourself, your background, how you got to where you are, and what services you provide the community?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am a full spectrum doula. My name is Amber and I use she and they pronouns. I live on the South Shore, but I serve the Boston area and as well as South Shore and down to like Beth Israel and Plymouth is like my hospital line. And I do go to Providence as well.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So like I mentioned, I'm a full spectrum doula and childbirth educator. I've been doing this work officially for about 5, almost 6 years. But I've been like kind of in and around the perinatal health field for over 10.
Yeah. I know when we first connected, you had some like cool stories and like background of like how you've kind of been in this world already.
Yeah,
I don't know
totally.
if you can hear this now. There's a truck beeping and backing up in my parking lot, of course, as we close the window here. Oh, it's not even a truck, it's a school bus. Anyways, this is what I say when I say I don't edit. All right, anyways, back to the actual conversation. Yeah, you had shared some like really cool stuff about how you had kind of like been around the birthy things all pretty much of your life, which is so amazing.
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah. So I love that. Now, I'm excited because I know you said obviously you're full spectrum, right? But a majority of what you do is typically the birth side of things.
Yeah, totally.
And so a lot of that includes birth plans, right? Which is the whole reason why I feel postpartum plans should be a thing.
Totally.
And why like the podcast is what it is. So I'm excited because when we were chatting, we kind of decided to take on the topic of like birth plans and how they can affect your postpartum and your postpartum plans, which I think is so huge because birth plans, we make them, right? But
yeah, totally. Like most people make them now, right?
Right. But then a lot of the time, from what I understand, correct me if I'm wrong, is that like obviously things can go sideways sometimes or things can change and we're hoping for the best. But I mean, in your experience, how often are you seeing clients having like the perfect plan according to their birth plan?
I mean, I think that, and as we talk about this a little more, I think that like there's just such a lack of nuance around birth planning that I try to bring to my clients. And what that like can look like is making sure that like their preferences are respected no matter how their birth ends up turning out. And so those are things like, you know, clothing and photos and like making sure that they feel comfortable and have movement access and things like that like we can do even with an epidural. We can do even if we're having an induction. We can do even if things end up in a C-section, right? So it's making sure that no matter where kind of the birth goes, it's those like preferences and those pieces of the plan that still go to plan. And so I do see like lots of times, right, people go in with they want they want, an unmedicated low intervention labor and birth, and they go in and they do end up wanting an epidural, right? Or something to that case. We do see that happen a lot. Right. But I will say, like, the vast majority of people who are prepping for that type of labor and birth experience are getting that type of labor and birth experience, especially because, like, if they're working for it, they're doing specific types of childbirth education, they're doing, they're hiring doulas, they're hiring support. Very typically, like, they're getting that type of birth experience depending on how the system treats them and how the, how their provider, was there coercion on board? Was there, like, a push for induction despite no medical need? Or, was there, or was there, like, something that came up, right? Like, I mean, I think that that's another huge piece is, like, you can't plan for preeclampsia. You can't plan for hypertension. You can't plan for, a million different scenarios of things, but we can plan, the type of environment and the type of support you're going to have in those moments. And that's really what I try to help people focus on.
I love that, because I do think that a lot of the time birth plans are kind of much more about, like, this is what I want, this, and this, and it's a specific thing or action rather than like the environment or setting, which I think can be really huge, because those are things that, like you said, you can adapt to whatever is going on around you in a way. So I love that. That's amazing. I didn't even think about that, but makes total sense.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that that's really, like, the part of birth planning that I focus on with clients is, like, how do you want to feel? How do you want, like, this moment to feel for you and your partner, or for just you, or however, in whatever scenario and setup they're giving birth, right? Who do you want to be present? How do you want those people to be present for you? Like, those are the things that I try to focus on more, about how they want the situation to feel versus, like, a very rigid, like, I want an unmedicated birth that looks like X, Y, and Z, and I, like, breathe my baby out in a sparkly tub covered in twinkle lights, right? Like, it's less about that, and it's more about, like, okay, so you want, like, dim lighting, and you want, candles, and you want, like, a really chill environment. You don't want a dance party, right? Which I've had the full range of both.
Right.
But I think that there's also a lot of pressure for people's births to look certain ways. And so I kind of dig into, like, why people want their birth to look that way.
I love that. I love it. And it's so specific to each person. And I think that the same thing goes for postpartum, right?
Yeah.
Now, you kind of brought up this idea of the postpartum being, obviously it's an extension of this birth, right?
Totally.
So, by planning these birth plans, you are setting yourself up in a way to be prepared for postpartum.
Exactly.
Right. And then we want, obviously, to prepare even more so, because this postpartum period is typically a longer period or time that you're thinking about supporting your family and yourself compared to, a birth. And so, yeah, we kind of dive into what can a birth plan that goes according to plan, how can that affect postpartum? And then also, how can a birth plan that may not have gone exactly how you expected or wanted, affect postpartum?
Totally. Well, I think, like, the big piece here is, like, there's been now, like, studies on, like, birth satisfaction rates and how that impacts postpartum mood disorders, right? And so this is kind of answering the second part of that question, is that, like, if birth doesn't go exactly the way that it's planned, or if there's some traumatic scenario, or, if there's some birth trauma and people don't feel satisfied with their birth experience, it leads to higher rates of postpartum depression and anxiety. So I think that having a birth plan and having birth preferences that, like, more read out about how you want the experience to look and how you want that support to look in the moment too, can lead to just better outcomes for postpartum, right? And I always say, like, birth is a moment, but it lives with you forever, right? Like, because, like, your birth experience is going to define so much of your postpartum, that it's so important to take that into consideration too. And so I think when I work with folks as their birth doula, I also do, like, and share postpartum plans with them, because I think that postpartum is really important to plan for. And as a full spectrum doula, like I understand that, even if, my specialty is like preconception to birth, because that's really like where I work the most. So I work a lot with fertility clients. I do a lot of like prenatal education, and the birth support. And like you said, like birth isn't right. Birth is not as long as postpartum. Postpartum's literally forever. Like once you have a child, that's the rest of your life. So I think that so many people don't plan for that long of a period, and they don't even plan for like 9 months or 6 months after, whereas they planned for 9 months for this little moment of birth. And so I think it's just, birth plans can really set you up for so much support for your labor and birth experience. And like having doula support in particular can like make sure that, even if things do go awry, even if they are like and do feel traumatic, that you have someone to process that with, you have somebody who is with you, walking you through the experience. And just like there's so much data about doula support in general, around birth, being that like, the birth satisfaction outcomes are significantly higher when you have a doula with you, or even just another support person. So I think that in particular that thread is really important because it sets you up for a more supported postpartum. And like, even if, you don't have a perfect birth plan, or you don't have like an exact plan or a way that you want labor to go, it's setting people up to like understand what happened during their labor experience, to help them kind of process through that more quickly, to help them get to the place of like, I'm a parent now, and now this is like the stuff I have to prepare for. And there's also just kind of the logistics of, I'm planning a vaginal birth, and like, what does healing look like? What does that mean for postpartum versus like, I had a C-section and this is what that's going to look like. And this is what my recovery is going to look like, and prepping and planning for that. And I always tell people like, plan for both, and, kind of like have an idea of what recovery is going to look like in both cases and scenarios. So that way you have things set up for yourself immediately postpartum too.
Yeah, I love that. It really is, because by giving yourself support, you don't have to sit and stress for 9 months really about the birth. You have the ability and the timeline to be able to think about postpartum. And I love the idea of being able to have a doula or a support person or somebody with you in order to process through that birth, like you said, quicker in a way, and feeling more confident in it. Because you may not have seen something or realized something happened, that may make you really happy, or feel better about the situation that may have happened.
So I can't tell you how many times like my first postpartum visit after a birth is just like walking people through their timeline of like, this happened, that, and they're like, I totally forgot about that. Like, I love that moment, or I love that nurse. And like, or like, that moment really sucked and was super hard, and I'm really glad you were there, or I'm really glad that my partner like was so engaged and supportive, right? And so I think like really looking back, like those are the, after birth, I always do one visit with my clients at the very minimum. And usually it's about processing their birth and helping them understand what happened during their labor and birth experience, even if it was smooth, even if it did go to plan. People forget things. Like it's so intense. And people really don't remember it all. So I think it's really important to have someone to like, even if it's not a doula, like even if it's just your cousin or your best friend, they can be like, oh, this happened then, and they might not understand like the medical terminology and those things, but like having someone to be able to process that through with is just so important. And I always say like, your partner's amazing, but they're probably not going to remember it either. Because they had their own. Well, not even that, is like partners had their own experience too.
Exactly.
Right? Like labor and birth can be really scary for partners, right? And it can be really intense and really hard. And they're experiencing becoming a parent too. So their take may be totally different than what you experienced.
So true. So true. Yeah. So during those visits where you kind of like are debriefing with people, and also, during that birth and like prenatal kind of sessions with clients, what kind of things are you suggesting that they kind of like, or I guess what bridges are you using to get them from like that birth plan to that postpartum plan? Like what kind of things are you suggesting to them postpartum? I know you mentioned, letting them prepare for, a vaginal delivery and a C-section just in case, or kind of like thinking through all the alternatives. But is there anything else specific that you typically suggest that they think about or kind of plan for postpartum?
Totally. I mean, I have a whole postpartum plan that I give to folks, and it's less of a plan and it's more just like questions to talk about together. Um, and I think that like this list in particular has come together over the last 6 years and has like become more and more refined, which I feel like is just doula work.
Yep.
The more you do it, the more you're like, no, that's not right. I need
Right,
to
we
like
need to add
change
this or take
thing.
away that. Yeah.
Add this and like go back and change this a little bit. But my postpartum plan that I give folks is very much like, it breaks down like baby care. It breaks out like how you're feeding baby, where baby's sleeping, food stuff, right? Like how many times a week are you ordering out is one of the questions I have on there. Are you going to be setting up a meal train? Who's managing that for you, right? How many hours of sleep do you think that you realistically need in a day? What do you need for self-care? What do you, especially for relationships, how are you going to maintain your relationship? What kind of self-care do you guys need for your relationship? What types of intimacy feel important for you outside of sex? Right. That's a big one that's in there. And so these are all kind of conversation starters that I like just give to clients to have them kind of start on their own, because I know that those conversations can also just be really hard to have with other people.
Yeah.
And so making sure that like partners are having the big talks, right? And like prepping birthing people in particular for like the shift that's going to come in within them, right? Like your whole personality changes and people now see you as a parent before they see you as you, right? And how are you going to handle those things? How is like, do you anticipate postpartum mood disorders? Have you struggled with depression or anxiety in the past or during your pregnancy? How is that going to look for you? What are you like, what support systems do you have in place to change, like to help you with that? Do you already have a therapist? Do you already have family that you can reach out to? Are you okay going to your partner and saying, hey, like I'm feeling really anxious today. Have you seen any of these red flags? Right. Or do you have a postpartum doula, or do you have that level of support that's gonna, kind of check in on you and see how you're doing? And are you okay sharing, right? Like those things. And those are all in the like postpartum planning pieces that I give to them, because I think it's really, really important that they have those discussions. And usually like I give that to them the first time we meet at a prenatal visit. And then our second prenatal visit, we kind of like start to flesh out a postpartum plan. And so usually those pieces are like me making sure they have continuing support, whether that's me or somebody else. And my birth clients know that they can reach out to me pretty much unlimited if they're struggling. So like if they're struggling postpartum, I'm happy to be continuing resource for them. And yeah, so like those are kind of the things that I do to kind of help them prep for postpartum, even though primarily I'm there for their birth support. But I think that, it's so left out of our culture and care about how, how postpartum really can impact you, right? And so I do agree, like postpartum plans are really, really important. Whether that's a support plan, whether that's just a conversation you've had with your partner about how you're going to care for your baby together, right? As long as you're having some type of conversation about what's going to happen after baby's here, I think it's really important. Because, I mean, early on in my doula career, I think so many people were like underprepared for their postpartum. And like, I was a new doula. I didn't know.
Right. No, fair enough.
And like, I think as I've learned more, I think there's less like prep that I do, quite honestly, for the birth and labor. It's more about like, here's the classes that I recommend, here's the classes that you can take with me. Here's the prep that looks like with you and I, but mostly like, how can we also prep for once baby's here? Because if we spend 9 months prepping just for your birth, like your postpartum is probably going to go sideways.
Right, for sure. I think that's so huge. I think that it just really, truly loops back to, you have 9 months to prep, and just prepping for one moment isn't going to be as helpful as prepping for that moment and the postpartum, right? And the period after. You have this time to think about things and to kind of prepare yourself. And that's the time, like you said, to have those tough conversations. I actually just recorded, and it'll be up tomorrow, aka it'll be up already when people are listening to this, but there'll be an episode up about communication and intimacy in partnerships with an amazing therapist. And so that's like a super good conversation to kind of start with and prepare for postpartum as well. So people can go back and listen to that. But I would love to get some information from you on if you had like a piece of advice to give people and a product recommendation that you have, whether it be birthy related, postpartum related. Doesn't have to be a specific product either. It could be like a service. But yeah, do you have something specific you would suggest, or what you would tell clients or people?
I mean, I think sincerely, like, I'm always going to recommend doulas, because I think that that's really the thing. For me, like, I'm not a big product person across the board. It's very funny. Like, my birth clients are always like, what do we need for a baby? And I'm like, a place for them to sleep. And like, you're feeding you whatever way you're feeding, right? So that means a breast pump, that means, bottles, that means formula, whatever that means for you. And like diapers, like that's what you need. I'm very like minimalistic, and my clients are very funny about it. They're like, really? That's like all I need? And I was like, you don't need like all the things, but like you can have them if you want them.
Right. It's also best to like start with the basics, right? Like a place to sleep, all those things you mentioned, a car seat, maybe a stroller if you're thinking that that's going to be your vibe, or a baby carrier, and then take it day by day. Like,
and well, not even that too, is like, I mean, I do baby wearing lessons. Like, I'm looking over, you obviously can't see me, but I'm like looking over to my wall, and I have like a million baby carriers. But like, for me, like, you don't know what your baby's going to like until they're here. You don't know how big they're going to be. You don't know, like, are you going to want more of a structured carrier because you had a C-section? Are you going to want some more like back support? Do you don't really know those pieces until after your baby's here.
And we have Amazon now. You can just click one
we
click,
have Amazon and like same day Target pickup.
Right.
Like, you can do whatever you want. It's funny. I mean, and like, I think that too, like starting with the very bare basics doesn't overwhelm parents, right? I do think it can be really, really overwhelming to be like, I need the little like putty spoon to like wipe diaper cream on my butt, like baby's butt. And I'm like, you don't need the spoon, use your finger. Like, I think it can be really overwhelming, the amount of like product that we are sold. And I mean, even around birth, right? I think that, there's so much stuff sold to people that they don't necessarily need. Like,
no,
you need your baby, and your body to birth your baby, like, truly. And a supportive partner and a like great provider, like that's what you need to have a baby. And I think that there are nice things to have, and there are things that are just totally not necessary, and there are things that I think work for some people and really don't work for others. And that's why, like, for me, like, I never blanket recommend anything, because I don't think, like, I could say a Haka is an amazing tool, but it could be terrible for someone else, right? Someone with an oversupply, I would never suggest a Haka, right? I would be like, no, let's do like passive milk collection instead, like nothing with suction, right? The little ladybug instead.
Exactly.
And so I think that like product recommendations for me are very individual based, right? If people are, struggling with certain things, I may suggest something versus like, suggesting certain products across the board.
Right.
I just had a family recently who knew that they would be traveling like 3 months postpartum. And I was like, you need that cool car seat that turns into a stroller. Like that amazing thing that it's the Doona, right?
The Doona. Yeah. And now some other companies are coming out with them too.
Yeah. And they're like super lightweight too, and very accessible. So, I mean, but I wouldn't recommend that to everybody, right? No. Like it's not something that I would recommend across the board. And it's hard to recommend products, but I will always recommend doulas because I do think that additional support comes in so handy for literally everybody. I don't think anyone could ever say no to additional support, especially if cost wasn't a barrier.
Right.
Which it totally is. I think that doula support can be seen as a luxury because it's pretty expensive. But so many of us work on sliding scales and payment plans and all the things. And so I think it's really important that if you can access that, to access that support.
I love that. I think that listeners must just assume that I just ask people previously, okay, what are you going to say that your service or advice is? And if they say doula, then I'll allow them on, because I feel like every episode, everyone just keeps saying it. But it's like, we're just slowly but surely turning all the listeners to like getting a doula, which I love. Just get a doula and then we'll stop talking about it.
And we just get a doula and then we probably won't stop talking about it though. Even if you get a doula, we won't stop.
No, we won't. But I think,
it's really important, right? I think that like having doula support, and not even just doula, like having support, period, right? Is that like your mom flying in and spending 2 weeks with you postpartum, right? I had a family who like has family support, which is amazing and is not always guaranteed for folks, but like they have family support for over a month, and they were like, we haven't done a single dish, we haven't done a single load of laundry since we've been home, and it's been 2 weeks. Right. And so like having some level of support, even if it's not a doula, but making sure that you like have built a community around yourself that's going to support you in this immediate postpartum time, I think is so, so important.
I love it. And I think it's so true. Everybody can be supported by somebody and have a beneficial, it's beneficial to everybody. Like people always come up to me and they're like, oh, well, if you have kids, like you must like, no, you're going to know everything. You won't need anything. And I'm like, no, I will need everything. Like I will need.
It's funny because someone else asked me this question in an interview recently, and I was like,
really?
Oh, interesting. They were like, if you were pregnant, would you hire a doula for birth? And I was like, yes,
absolutely.
Like it doesn't even matter that I'm a doula. All that stuff's going to fall out of my brain. Like I'm not going to remember how to support myself in that moment.
Yep.
Right. So it was really interesting to be asked that. And they were like, would you hire a postpartum doula too? And I was like, most likely. I mean, I have a really good like support network, so I don't know that I would necessarily need it.
Right.
But I mean, overnight support, heck yeah. Right. Like,
oh yeah, if you can get the support and you can afford it and make it work for your family, or find somebody that is able to be a bit more flexible with their payment plan or pricing or things like that to meet your needs. Yeah, totally.
Yeah, exactly.
I love it.
And so it was cool to be asked that in an interview. I was very intrigued by, I was like, where did you find this question? What doula blog told you to ask this?
Right.
But it was cool to be like, yeah, heck yeah, I wouldn't, rely. They were like, but you already know so much, like you would kind of like, how would, sure, I know these things logically, but I'm not in my logic brain anymore when I'm in labor, right? Like that goes away. And like, it's really incredibly hard to advocate for yourself in labor, even if you know how to advocate for yourself. And having a doula can really like mitigate that.
Right. Even doulas need doulas, guys.
It's true. I have had the great privilege of working with a few doulas as their doula.
Oh my gosh.
And it's always been so incredible and special and like very heartwarming. Those births like are very special and near and dear to me.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. I love that. Is there anything else that you would like to share with listeners before we wrap up today? Anywhere where they can find you? I know you do most of your support in person, and you kind of gave info on where that is, but do you have for childbirth education? Do you do that virtually as well, or do you just do in-person classes?
Yeah, so I do a virtual and in person, but I'm only doing private classes right now. Watch out for the new year. Group classes might be coming. But for now I do virtual and in person, and only private, which I know a lot of folks like to seek out because I can like really tailor the education to what they're hoping for. Yeah, so that's kind of like a little, so I do a lot of virtual doula support too, and especially around fertility care. So if folks are looking for that care, no matter where you are in the world, I'm available for that. Especially for queer families and conception support.
I love that. I love that so much. And all of Amber's info will be below. So if you are interested in connecting with her, you can check that out. And thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Thank you so much for tuning into the Postpartum Plan podcast. I hope that today's episode brought you support, relatability, and valuable insight. Remember, you're not alone on this journey. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and leave a review and share with any of your prenatal and postpartum friends and family. Your feedback helps us reach more parents seeking support. And if you're looking for additional resources, please feel free to connect via Instagram at Serene Moments Doula for constant information, tips, and tricks, or check out my website, www.serenemomentsdoula.com. See you next week.